Welcome to Calm Historian, where we slip into the creak of wagon wheels and the hush of prairie grass, traveling cross-country with a mid-1800s wagon train. We'll feel the slow miles, the campfire smoke, and the quiet courage that carried families toward an unknown horizon. Before we begin, comment your location and your current local time, and if this gentle journey suits you, please like and subscribe. They left in the pale light of a spring morning. Wagons lined up like a slow-moving village, canvas sails taut against a cool, still breeze. Men tightened hames and checked pins. Women lifted children into small bundles and smoothed bonnets against the dust. Behind them, the town. A row of wooden stores, a ferry crossing, the last patch of cultivated land, grew smaller until the long ribbon of the trail and the wide open country lay ahead. For families leaving in the middle decades of the 19th century, that moment held the same strange blend of relief and trembling. Relief at finally being on the road toward promised land, gold, or a new start, and a quiet fear for the unknown miles between them and whatever lay at journey's end. The wagons themselves were built for the road, not the heavy Conestogas of the East, but narrower prairie schooners, white canvas stretched over wooden bows, rocking on iron-bound wheels. Inside the boxes were the things that could not be carried on a man's back: barrels of flour, salted pork, coffee and sugar packed in cloth, a few china plates wrapped in newspapers, trunks of clothes and quilts, a frying pan or two, and a Bible that somehow always came to rest on top. Water casks rode close to the tongue. Ox yokes waited on the bows. Oxen were chosen more often than horses or mules for their steady strength and forgiving appetites. They pulled at an even, deliberate pace that matched the walking men and the small, tired feet of children. They traveled with rules. Each dawn a small council met to pick the day's course. How many miles to aim for, where to make the last camp, when to ford a river or follow its bank. Companies usually elected a captain or followed a veteran emigrant, not as a strict commander, but as a voice of experience. The trail was long, and survival depended on cooperation. Simple laws were enforced quickly. No straggling after dusk, no reckless firing near livestock, no taking another man's turn at the water barrel without consent. When disputes rose, they were settled around the last embers of the evening fire, where compromise and common sense had to carry the day. The pace was steady, unromantic arithmetic, 10 to 15 miles a day, wagons rolling along the Platte River's sandy bottomlands in spring, past tall bluffs and across great stretches of waving grass. At times, the trail cut straight through prairies that seemed to stretch forever, grasses whispering, heat shimmering on the horizon. At other hours, they wound between wind-sculpted rock formations with names like Chimney Rock and Scott's Bluff. Those landmarks kept people sane. Progress was measured not in miles on a ledger, but in milestones scratched into memory and carved into the sides of wagons. Mornings began with a ritual of noise: the creak of iron rims on wooden spokes, or the clank of harnesses, the lowing of oxen. Men checked draft animals' feet for sand and sores, greased axles, spliced rigging, and mended broken spokes with the practical patience of those who knew a whole company could be stalled by a single, shattered wheel. Women, or those who had taken on household duties because there were fewer women in a company, stirred embers, rolled biscuits, and measured flour by eye. Coffee boiled, its rich smell rising and mingling with dust and leather. Children chased stray chickens or clustered along the wagon rails to listen to old emigrant stories. Each wagon kept a tiny domestic world inside it. A folding table, a pot, a cradle, a stack of magazines, or a prized almanac. The wagons were ship and house at once. Most days were hard, steady labor. Men walked beside the teams, guiding yoked oxen and watching for soft ground where a wheel might bog, or for prairie dog holes that could jerk an axle. When a river had to be crossed, they unhitched teams and unloaded wagons, guiding each crate, chest, and barrel across by ferry, or by making temporary trains of logs and ropes. Night brought new chores. Animals turned into tight enclosures, fires tamped down, sentries posted to ward off wolves, and the quieter dangers of a prairie night. People boiled coffee, ate salt pork or rehydrated beans, and talked of letters to be written, of children they hoped to raise in sunnier fields, of ghosts that haunted old homesteads, and of what might be found at journey's end. Dangers were never far off. Cholera could sweep a company into mourning in hours, and careful cooks and clean water did not always keep it at bay. Whole families were sometimes stricken. The strong carried the weak, or left them for burial, where the grass would grow over a small, hurried grave. Other illnesses, dysentery, fevers, came with the dust and the heat. Accidents happened as well. Falls from wagons, crushed hands, or a wheel shattered on a hidden rock. The constant risk taught immigrants to be watchful and stoic. When death came, it was often marked with a small pit by the roadside, a wooden headboard, or initials carved into a wheel. Mourning had its economy. Tears at night, practical arrangements by day. Not every memory of the trail was hardship. There were days like pilgrimage, gilded in sun and laughter. Men and women traded stories and recipes. Some struck friendships that lasted a lifetime. At trading posts and forts, Fort Laramie among them, travelers could replenish supplies and hear news of the world ahead. In earlier years, buffaloes marched in black rivers across the plains. Hunters took what was needed, meat smoked, and shared to stretch thin stores of flour. Children learned to lean into the road's rhythm. In 3 months of walking, they grew taller, their legs hard as roots, faces freckled and sun-streaked. Encounters with Native American peoples were varied and complex. For many crossing parties, first meetings began in wary curiosity and ended in trade or mutual courtesy. For others, misunderstandings turned tense. There were shared laughs over the price of a horse or the quality of trade goods, and sharp negotiations over water, game, or passage. The history of these meetings is not a single tale, but many small stories, each company meeting its own reality along the trail. When the mountains came, everything changed. After long stretches of prairie, South Pass unlocked the way over the Rockies, and the air thinned. Storms moved in without warning, and snow could fall late into spring. Day-long rains turned slopes into ankle-deep mud and ruts. Men unhooked and led their teams through the muck, set up camp early to give animals time to forage, and wrapped wet blankets around shivering children. The calendar of the trail became as much a measure of seasons as of miles. Leave in spring after the rivers thawed, cross the Great Plains in summer, reach the mountains before the first hard frost. Delay could mean being caught by a sudden cold snap, with deadly consequences. Coming down from the hills, travelers found valleys that promised fruit trees, irrigated strips of green, and the tumbling frames of churches or schools. In California, the gold fever buzzed in the air alongside saloons and makeshift camps. In Oregon, there were claims for timber and farms. For Mormons who followed Brigham Young, the Salt Lake Valley waited, an open basin where a community might be raised by deliberate plan. For many, the end of the trail was only the start of another, longer labor. Breaking sod, laying foundations, and building homes and churches. On one of those first nights at Journey's End, the wagons were uncoupled and turned into final shelters. People walked the last miles themselves, stretching tired muscles and turning to look back at the long line of trail dust, the horizon now cut by a new skyline. A river town, a cluster of cabins, a field that might one day be a farm. Children cast off tethers and ran. Men sat on overturned barrels, smoking and watching the setting light paint faces they had come to know as close as kin. Women unfolded quilts and laid them across rough-hewn beds, and someone read aloud from a Bible or an almanac. Tears and laughter mingled, mourning for what they had left, gratitude for what they had survived, and a fierce, tentative hope for what would come next. This, then, was the road across a continent, a slow, tireless passage of work and wonder, of basic needs and bold dreaming. It reshaped the lives of those who traveled it, stamped itself into their language and songs, and became part of a larger story, painful in places, hopeful in others, of how people moved across a vast land to make new homes. Over 500,000 people crossed the plains and the mountains toward the west coast in the mid-1800s. That fact was a kind of distant drum in my head as I worked, a larger movement that gave weight to a smaller imagined one. Back in November, when the air outside my window had that faint, brittle edge and the light slanted low and gold across the desk, I was hunched over the first draft of my latest NaNoWriMo project. I remember the sound of the keys like a practiced heartbeat, the rough comfort of a steaming mug, the little inventory of half-formed sentences stacked like kindling beside the laptop. I called the story Little Africa for now, just a working title, a name that held a place and a promise in equal measure. I had even written an article about that place, a small companion piece to guide myself through the textures and history I wanted to honor. And that background lived with me as I wrote. The smells, the voices, the landscape, anchored in research and affection. There was a steadiness to the work, a daily ritual of showing up and letting scenes accumulate until the shape of the book started to make itself known. The title was a scaffold, something to hold the project while it found its true face. I could already feel that a better, truer name would present itself later, after a few more drafts and a little more listening. Still, even a provisional name can root a story, and Little Africa gave my world enough weight that characters began to move as if they had been waiting for me to open the gate. As the manuscript grew, so did the sense of direction. It was in that careful, fumbling last act of drafting, when doubts are loudest and everything feels both fragile and inevitable, that I made a decision about how to close the tale. I chose, at the end, to send my characters west with a wagon train. The image arrived not as an add-on, but as a resolution that belonged to them. A line of wagons against a broad sky, the creak of timber and leather, the forward tilt of people carrying histories and hopes into a new horizon. Deciding that they would go west with a wagon train felt right in my bones. It gave the story a movement and a promise of departure, that stayed true to the world I had been building. The choice tied the intimate rhythms of my characters to that larger, restless migration, the echoes of those 500,000 who once turned toward the Pacific, and let the final pages move with the same mixture of fear, faith, and stubborn forward motion that people have always carried when they step into the unknown. Even though I knew I would end the book with them going to the West Coast by wagon train, I decided not to write a whole novel about that part of the story. Instead, I'm including the material in the footnotes at the back. Extra context for anyone who wants it. The reason is simple. The tale of people crossing the prairie to the west has been told many times before. That doesn't stop me from writing about it here, or from treating it with care. It just means I won't try to reinvent a story that already belongs to so many voices. In the spring of 1834, a different kind of journey began to take shape across the continent. The wagon train experience that would come to define a generation of Western travel. It started quietly and resolutely, with two very different men and a company of ordinary people facing an extraordinary undertaking. One was Nathaniel Wyeth, a practical New England merchant driven by trade and exploration. The other was Jason Lee, an Episcopalian missionary whose faith had turned his eyes west. Together they gathered a party of 80 souls and set out from Missouri on a single, daunting idea: to travel 2,070 miles to Oregon. Picture the morning they left, the creak of wooden wheels, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft rustle of canvas as wagons were readied. Families, laborers, and dreamers settled into their places, while low voices mixed with the sound of harnesses and the occasional laugh. Dust rose in long plumes beneath the wagons, drifting like a promise and a warning, while the scent of fresh horse sweat and campfire smoke hung in the air. Each person carried something to the trail: provisions, tools, prayers, hopes, and together they tested the first steps of a route no one yet called a highway. Day after day they followed a line across the continent that would later be known simply as the Oregon Trail, threading its way over plains and fords, under wide skies that could shift from iron-gray storms to a merciless high sun. They did not run a race. They walked that 2,170 miles as a shared experiment in endurance and hope. 80 people, bound by purpose, were guided by a merchant who knew how to move supplies and read country, and by a missionary who carried convictions and a sense of mission that kept people steady when the way grew hard. That first long passage was more than a trip. It was the beginning of a new American story, a human-scale act of crossing and making. Maps slowly folded into paths under their wheels. Strangers learned to trust one another at night around a single fire. The land took their stamps of wheel and boot, and the line they carved through grass and riverbeds would later guide countless others. In those footprints and ruts, with every repeated crossing, the wagon train as an idea was born. By the end of the 1860s, about 500,000 pioneers had set off overland to the far west. They left behind farms, shops, and whole neighborhoods. They left behind wives, siblings, parents, and children they might never see again. They traveled light when they could, with canvas and wood, with oxen and a few tired horses, trading certainty for a promise of new land, gold, or simply a new life. They walked and rolled across half a continent, over endless prairie, across high deserts, through snow that could pile ankle-deep or rise to the axles, moving through places that would later be called Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, Idaho, and Oregon. On the trail, people kept rough tallies of risk, and one figure haunted every camp. About 1 in 10 who started out would not finish. That 10% was not the result of pitched battles or famous ambushes, but of the slow, ordinary cruelties of the road. Fever and dysentery could sweep through a wagon circle like a cold wind, taking infants and mothers first. Minor wounds that back home would have healed became mortal when clean water and a skilled hand were days away. Rivers that rose with spring runoff swallowed men and horses. Wagon wheels broke, and a snapped axle could crush a leg. A single misstep on a narrow ridge or a rotten log might mean a fall with no rescue. These were sudden, ordinary ends, accidents and infections, exposure and the steady wasting of exhaustion. The loudest stories that reached city papers and barroom talk of constant raids and massacres were darker and simpler than the truth of most journeys. Native attacks did occur in certain places and at certain times, but they were not the principal cause of death among westward travelers. Far more were stolen away by sickness and misfortune, by the hunger and cold that came when weather turned, by the endless rubbing of skin against canvas and bone, against a wagon bench. Whole circles of wagons would grow quieter as coughs deepened, as cheeks hollowed. Children's laughter would thin into a stunned silence, as if the land itself required a different kind of attention. When death came, burials were quick and often crude. A hole scraped with a shovel, a plank laid over a fresh grave, a penciled name on a stick driven into the earth. These were the markers of necessity. Families did the burying themselves. A baby wrapped in a scrap of blanket, a hurried prayer offered over a man who had loved the road, or simply the clasping of hands and the resolute, wordless decision to keep moving, because wagons waited and supplies ran low. On bright mornings, the trail would lie before them as though untouched, but the sides told another story. Small low mounds like bumps in a carpet, a night row of stones, a bent fence rail pushed into the ground where someone had lain down to sleep forever. Those markers gathered into a kind of moving cemetery. Travel along the routes felt less like a map than like a ledger of memory. Names whispered beside a campfire, a cross scratched into the bark of a cottonwood, a child's toy buried shallow to mark a mother's last place. The people who made the phrase, spoken in sadness and a kind of weary truth, meant more than a line on a map. They meant an experience. Each creak of the wheel, each call to hitch up and move on, kept time with those little graves. The cost of the journey was not counted by headlines or by the number of skirmishes, but in the silent places left along the road. Every mound and marker, every whispered name, reminded the living that the West was won and lost in ways too ordinary to make the newspapers. In the fevers that came at night, in the accidents that happened in an instant, in the slow folding of life into the raw, moving landscape. The pioneers kept going, carrying memory and loss with them, always aiming for a new horizon that some never reached. Why did they take this journey? The answer was never a single line on a map, but a tangle of quieter urgencies, fear, hope, and the stubborn insistence of a younger generation that could not be satisfied where their parents had planted. In the eastern towns and crowded river ports, life stamped its toll on ordinary people. Houses huddled close, streets choked with travelers and freight, and the air itself could turn dangerous. Fevers like malaria and the cruel swift sickness of dysentery did not spare the poor or the well-to-do. They threaded through families, left households reduced, and made the promise of a new sunrise mean nothing while someone burned through the night. Men and women who had known steady toil looked at crawling infants, at a shivering grandmother, or at the yellowed face of a child, and measured the risk of staying in places where sickness could so easily find them. Others left, not because the land had failed them entirely, but because they were the children of the land, born under the steady creak of a pioneer roof, raised on the backs of fathers who read weather in the smell of the soil. These families had pushed into Indiana, into Illinois, and into the broad reaches of the Michigan territories. They carved farms out of prairie and forest, built cabins, dug wells, raised crops, and in doing so, staked a claim on a piece of the world. But time, as it always does, shifted the horizon. The oldest pioneers held the choicest strips of river bottom, those low black ribbons of land where the soil was rich and the water near at hand. And the next generation found there simply was no room to step into what their parents had already taken. For the young people raised with axe and plow, the choice felt inevitable. Move on. The best river-bottom lands, the places that grew corn as if by habit and gave up a harvest with less struggle, had long ago been called and fenced. Beyond those stripling fields lay other parcels, higher and drier, often less forgiving of a first farmer's mistakes. They were rockier, thin with clay or stony loam, and demanded more work for less return, yet they were all that remained for many. Pressure from without made things worse. Immigrants poured in, drawn by the promise of land and a new start. Their arrival sharpened the competition even for parcels that once might have been passed over. Where once a homestead might be had by sweat and patience, now the bidding of need and chance pushed families into a contest for soil and sunlight. Maps of opportunity had been drawn and redrawn. Fences and claims marked what could no longer be taken for granted. So people folded what they could carry and went in search of another place to plant a plow. They were not all romantic adventurers, but practical seekers. Those who feared the sick room, those whose children had no future on cramped holdings, and those crowded out by the steady influx of newcomers. They moved west, looking for the next stretch of ground where a plow could turn, a house could stand, and a life might be made secure. 70% of the travelers were farmers. They knew that to get the best land, they had to get there first. And in 1850, the U.S. Congress made that race a little more urgent by offering a promise on paper. A square mile, 640 acres, to each married couple, land that their children could inherit. That legal guarantee changed the map in people's heads. It turned the West into not only a place to try your luck, but a place to put down roots. Then the gold began to glint. Nuggets and gleams found in California spread like a summons. In the wind, in the papers, in the port taverns, pulling men and women, packs and hopes, across oceans and plains toward the farthest shore. The promise of sudden fortune arrived alongside the quieter, steadier one of land. For many, the parcel for settlers was as real and as urgent as the flash of a pan in a mountain stream, an invitation to stake a claim, and build a life. So in 1849, the movement swelled. Families and single men joined the flow. Some left in small caravans of wagons that rocked over rutted roads and desert flats. Others trusted their fate to wooden ships that crept around jagged Cape Horn or hurried across the isthmus. The journey became a kind of rite. Long days of heat and dust, sudden storms that tested tents and nerves, the constant creak of leather and wood, and nights under unfamiliar stars. There were bursts of laughter and old camp songs, but also the low private fears of those who had turned their backs on settled lives. People carried pans and picks, kettles and blankets, letters folded into trunks, and with them an almost impossible brightness of possibility. When they reached the Sierra foothills, the land itself announced a change. Steep ridges rose like folded maps, rivers silvered across rock, and groves of oak and pine shaded willow-edged creeks. Camps sprang up where water ran clear, men elbowed for claims, hands raw with work, eyes fixed on the next sluice box or the next wash of gravel. The air thrummed with the clink of tools, the murmur of bargaining, and the low prayers of those who had come both for gold and for the acre that might make a family's future. That year, 1849, the human tide toward California reshaped lives and remade a region. Thousands answered the call to seek fortune on the West Coast, some chasing a glint in the stream, others chasing a deed in the dirt. And together they altered the face of the land and the course of American hope. Some headed west to find land, some chased gold, and in the 1860s a number left to escape the shadow of the Civil War. Whatever their reasons, nearly every pioneer carried the same belief, that the growth of the United States was somehow destined, a conviction known as manifest destiny that made the unknown feel like inevitability. Independence, Missouri, sat on the lip of the known world, like the last farmhouse at the edge of a vast, gambling field. It was where conversations slowed and harnesses squealed, where wagons were lashed and the last letters folded and tucked away. From that dusty crossroads, the great arteries of the West poured out into the prairie, ribbons of rutted track that would lead traders, families, missionaries, and dreamers toward futures they could barely imagine. Picture a morning there, the low sun catching on canned iron and damp leather, the clink of chains as axles were greased, the coppery smell of coffee and horse. Men checked maps drawn in their heads. Women packed cloth bundles and shut trunks that had become whole worlds. Children stole one more look at shuttered storefronts and familiar porches, at a town that would stay behind while they moved into emptier country. Around them, the land opened, prairie folding into sky, trails turning into pale lines in the dust that ran out like veins to the unknown. The choices at that crossroads were stark and simple. To the southwest, the Santa Fe Trail cut across sun-baked plains and scrubbed toward a different cadence of place. Traders and immigrants with a taste for commerce followed its steady ruts, carrying goods and stories between distant settlements under a wide, hot sky. Due west lay the California Trail, a long spine on the map pointing toward Sacramento and the rivers beyond. It drew those who wanted new soil, new weather, or the chance to begin again beneath a foreign but generous sun. Travelers imagined the sound of water long before they reached it, a cool promise against the dust, a distant music that kept them moving on. Stretching northwest, the Oregon Trail unfurled through passes and plains, through nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch. Families bound for Oregon learned patience and courage as they crossed rivers, threaded forests, and climbed ridgelines where one mistake could mean delay or disaster. Yet the trail offered a reward: wide land, the hope of community, and the chance to plant roots in a place both wild and welcoming. A parallel story began farther east. The Mormon Trail did not start at Independence, but in Nauvoo, Illinois. Those who answered that call gathered from homes and meeting houses, crossed the Missouri River north of Independence at a place called Council Bluff, and turned their wagons west into the same wilderness. Their path ran alongside other emigrants for stretches, and near Fort Laramie, in what is now Wyoming, the tracks converged, strangers becoming neighbors on the same long road. The trails were more than lines on a map. They were decisions made at dawn and dusk, to turn left or right, to wait a day for better weather, to press on through a night of rain. Independence was the last place to set one's affairs in order, and the first place where the sheer emptiness and promise of the country were truly felt. Whether a family took the Santa Fe route to the southwest, set their faces for Sacramento, pushed northwest toward Oregon, or joined the Mormon exodus from Nauvoo to the common track near Fort Laramie, each wagon left a line of hope in the dust, and a story etched into the vast, indifferent beauty of the American West. They had to pick a narrow window to leave. The prairie needed time to green so animals could graze, which meant no wagon rolled out before mid-April, but leave too late, and the mountains could bite with early snows. June was out of the question. That left only the stretch from mid-April through May, a choice that traded late spring grass for the certainty of swollen rivers, violent thunderstorms, and a blistering midsummer sun when the road ran through the deserts of southern Wyoming, Idaho, and eastern Oregon. Into their wagons went the practical things everyone expected: cloth and nails, tins of salted pork, and barrels of flour. But tucked between the blankets and the hand tools was something softer, yet no less essential: a stack of travel guidebooks. In trading posts and tiny frontier bookshops, these worn paperbacks traveled as eagerly as horses or oxen. One that people talked about most was The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California by Lansford Hastings. Men and women gathered around its pages by lamplight and under campfire glow, turning leaves that still carried the faint smell of printer's ink and dust, tracing thin black lines that promised to make sense of the uncertain miles ahead. Those books were more than folded paper and ink. They were experience translated into sentences and measurements, the voice of people who had walked, ferried, or forced their wagons across the same reaches. They listed distances between watering holes and trading posts, so families could count off days and figure how to ration biscuits. They marked river crossings with blunt warnings or calm reassurances, enough detail for a man to test the depth with a pole, or for a leader to decide whether to wait for the spring swell to fall. They printed prices for staples, flour, sugar, lead, canvas, numbers that were compared, added, and folded into the thin leather purse of savings. The pages named dangers as plainly as they named places, stretches where wagons had bogged down in mud, trails where food ran dangerously low, and the kinds of storms and accidents that might shatter a wheel or sweep a camp. Around every table where a guide lay open, voices grew quieter and plans grew firmer. A mother would trace a column of suggested supplies with a careful finger, imagining the small cruelties of what had to be left behind. A young husband penciled notes beside lists of river crossings, trying to decide if an extra set of wagon spokes might save them weeks of delay. An elder, who had seen steeper passes in worse weather, would nod at a description and offer a single remembered word of counsel. Those books did not banish fear. Instead, they gave it a shape, a map to consult on long nights, a ledger to tally costs, a list of hazards to be read aloud and discussed until strategies formed. In the flat light of morning, as wagons were hitched and the horizon opened, the guidebook's quiet authority could be seen in the way companies talked, packed, and moved. Hope and careful planning rode together, bound hand in hand as the road led west. Experienced travelers of the overland trails almost always chose oxen over horses or mules. Oxen were easier to manage. They were less likely to bolt or die under constant strain. They cost less up front and were worth more once you reached Oregon. And when things got desperate, you could always turn to them for food. A successful journey usually meant a wagon hitched to 3 yokes of oxen, 2 animals to a yoke, the steady, patient power that could keep a caravan moving day after day. If you've seen old westerns, you know the picture. A rolling ocean of canvas, covered wagons glinting white under a wide sky, lines of families and freight stretching to the horizon. The Conestoga wagon is the star of that scene. Its high, swept cover and stout silhouette, read perfectly on film. It looks noble and unstoppable, and so it keeps appearing in posters, dime novels, and on the big screen whenever a filmmaker wants to evoke a certain mythic westward sweep. But that image hides a truth. The Conestoga was a heavy freight wagon designed for hauling big loads over firm, well-kept roads, not for threading a path across endless prairie, plunging through spring thaw, or picking its way over rocky mule paths. Put one of those hulking machines down on soft ground, and the charm goes quickly. The canvas sags, the frame settles, wheels begin to bite into the earth and sink. Where weight gives the Conestoga its grandeur, the same weight becomes a liability in mud and at river crossings. Animals strain at their traces, spokes creak, and a team can find itself fruitlessly tugging at an immovable mass, while the river surges and daylight runs out. In a narrow pass, the problem becomes sharper. That bulk, which looks dramatic on film, turns into an obstacle. On steep, broken trails, there's no grace in a heavy wagon, only the constant danger of jamming or tipping, and the slow, exhausting work of prying each wheel forward. Those cinematic vistas erase the small, stubborn decisions travelers actually made. Choosing a lighter, wider, more nimble wagon, hitching the right number of oxen, planning a route that avoided the worst fords and the stickiest mud. Imagine the real sounds and feelings of the trail, the hollow thump of a wheel as it finds wet earth and settles an inch deeper, the low, rhythmic heave of oxen yoked beyond comfort, muscles straining under leather and rope, the tense hush that falls when a heavy load teeters on an uneven ridge, and every pair of hands goes quiet, waiting for the next move. Those moments weren't dramatic in the way movies make them. They were grinding, dangerous, often dull. And they taught the hard truth. Magnificence in a stable depot can be a sentence on a muddy riverbank. So when a film shows a long line of white-hooded wagons gliding across badlands, as if pulled by fate, remember the unseen counterpoint. The Conestoga's shape tells a simple visual story, and that story is why it endures. But the real history of overland travel is a far grittier tale of compromise. of choosing animals and wagons that would keep you moving, of sacrificing grandeur for maneuverability, of getting over one more ridge, through one more ford, and on toward whatever lay beyond. Most pioneers moved west in a wagon called the Prairie Schooner, 4 feet across and 10 feet long, light but stubbornly strong. Its sides stood straight or leaned out a little, and bent wood ribs held a waterproofed canvas like a low, rolling sky. It could carry up to about 2,500 pounds of supplies, a hard limit that meant the wagon was never a carriage of comfort. There was simply not enough room, and so the rule of the road was plain. Most people walked. That limit set the tone for every morning's work. At the side of each wagon, a quiet negotiation took place, a sorting of essentials and desires that felt more like triage than packing. Every extra barrel, each spare iron tool, every heavy loaf of bread was weighed not only on scales of usefulness, but against the slow, patient strength of the oxen. Families became committees of necessity. Mothers smoothed quilts and folded them thinner. Fathers lashed trunks and rewrapped bundles, and children received strict, practical chores that left no room for whim. It wasn't thrift for its own sake. It was survival. Sometimes the final compromise meant people stepped down from axles and onto the hard road. Their own bodies counted as part of the burden. So they walked, not by choice, but by design. And they walked close to the teams that pulled their lives forward. Men and women kept a steady constellation around the oxen, feet finding a rhythm over ruts and stones, walking at dawn when the air was clear, and again in late light, when dust rose like lazy smoke. Children padded beside older siblings, small fingers looping the rope that guided an ox or brushing a harness with a careful hand. To steer an animal was to be both mechanic and companion, a soft word here, a gentle prod there, watching the animal's breathing, the way its hoof sank into the trail. Those hours drew people into an unusual closeness with the beasts that carried their future, a quiet tenderness and an everyday reliance that kept the caravan moving mile after mile. Only those who were too ill or too weak to walk rode in the canvas-shadowed bed of the wagon. To climb in was to feel relief at the sudden absence of gravel beneath one's feet, and at the same time, a pang of reluctance. A mother might rock a fevered child in the dim while her husband walked beside the team, or a son might lift an old man whose legs had failed into the safe, swaying space. Riding meant warmth and protection, but also dependence, a helpless watching as the world passed slowly by on its wheels. There was often a subtle guilt in being carried, while others strained under the same sun, and so those who could kept their boots on the ground. When weather and luck allowed, families sometimes turned a wagon into a cramped sleeping room, stretching boards and blankets into a low bed beneath the canvas hood. In rain or bitter cold, that little sheltered space could be a stout refuge where a few bodies lay without the sky above them. More often, though, they chose the open night, canvas tents smelling of smoke and tar, or the bare, wide country under the stars. To lie under that dark ceiling, watching constellations slowly wheel, was to feel both infinitesimal and fiercely alive. Men kindled small fires that threw orange halos over faces. Women hummed low songs that helped breathing slow and bodies relax. Blankets were pulled tight. The cracked earth became an odd kind of cradle. Children, suddenly solemn and skinned-kneed, whispered of the day's small adventures before sleep took them. At night every sound carried. The long moan of an ox, the rustle of bedding, the faint murmur of other travelers learning like them to make a road out of uncertainty. Space inside and on the wagons was always a carefully made calculation. Food, tools, salted meat, spare harnesses, a pot for every purpose, and a trunk for seasonal clothing. Each item earned its place through argument, testing, and a stark appraisal of need. Bundles that might be needed quickly were tied above the axles or lashed along the sides. Water skins, odds and ends, medicines kept under close watch. Tarps were drawn tight over anything that could spoil or be shattered. Ropes were knotted in known ways that could be undone in a hurry. A wagon became a small island of intent, its crates and bundles arranged by necessity and affection, a visible ledger of what a family prized and what it refused to abandon. And so they went on, walking and riding, sleeping under canvas or stars, learning day by day what weight could be carried and what must be left behind. In those choices lived 1,000 quiet decisions, acts of love and duty, calculations of economy and raw endurance. The road took its due, but the people made a life along its length, balancing the burden between the wooden bed of the wagon and the strength of their own 2 feet. A complete wagon, 3 yokes of oxen, and the food needed for a 5-member family cost a minimum of $600, equal to about $15,000 in today's money. Poor farmers weren't always able to come up with that kind of cash, so they turned to whatever options they could find, selling a parcel of land to a neighbor for whatever it would fetch, signing on with a sponsor who would fund the trip across the country in exchange for repayment once the new farm began to earn, or sending single young men and women ahead or along as hired trail helpers for wealthier travelers. On the edge of the clearing, the wagons stood like patient beasts, canvas flapping and lanterns swinging in the last light, while families finished the endless small calculations of departure. They measured everything twice. How much would fit? How much would last? What could be left behind? For each adult, the provision list was precise and stubborn, written like a ledger and prayed over like a talisman. 200 pounds of flour, 30 pounds of pilot bread, 75 pounds of bacon, 10 pounds of rice, 5 pounds of coffee, 2 pounds of tea, 25 pounds of sugar, half a bushel of dried beans, 1 bushel of dried fruit, 2 pounds of saleratus, 10 pounds of salt, half a bushel of cornmeal, a half bushel of parched ground corn, and tucked at the bottom, a small keg of vinegar. Those numbers were not just inventory. They were the texture of the voyage. 200 pounds of flour meant sacks stacked shoulder high, a dull white smell that could be coaxed into a thick porridge at dawn, dumplings at noon, or the thin loaf that would stretch a family across a week. 30 pounds of pilot bread, tough and implacable, lay wrapped in oilcloth as the emergency ration for swollen rivers or days when game failed. 75 pounds of bacon hung in the rafters of makeshift lean-tos or packed into barrels, its smoky, salty fat promising fried slices for breakfast, and grease to make beans and corn taste like something more than hunger. 10 pounds of rice and 5 pounds of coffee offered different comforts. Rice to bulk out a scant stew, coffee to warm chilled hands and steady tired eyes at dawn. 2 pounds of tea sat ready for quiet mornings or polite company at the wagon's edge. 25 pounds of sugar was a small, glittering hope. Dissolved into coffee, used to preserve fruit, a bright lift on otherwise gray days. Half a bushel of dried beans and a full bushel of dried fruit were the long-term ballast. Beans to simmer into one-pot meals that fed many, and fruit to chew for quick energy or to be turned, on a generous afternoon, into a rare pie when flour and saleratus permitted. Saleratus, 2 pounds of it, was the invisible miracle, the leavening that might turn a dense flat into something more like bread. 10 pounds of salt served as both seasoning and preservative, the difference between safe meat and a sickness that could end a family's hopes. Half a bushel of cornmeal and a half bushel of parched ground corn provided variety. Corn cakes at the fire, a thick spoonful of polenta against the wind, parched corn eaten like trail cereal when travel allowed no pause, and the small keg of vinegar, sour, sharp, almost miraculous, was at once cleaner, medicine, and pantry, for pickling, for scouring pots, for dressing a wound when soap and doctor were miles away. Every sack and barrel carried more than calories. They held routines and consolation. The smell of bacon and coffee in the morning, the clatter of a tin spoon against a chipped plate, the secret pleasure of a sugar-sweetened mouth. These were the little mercies that kept people moving. The provisions were thrift made tangible. A plan against storms, a hedge against hunger, a promise that the kitchen could be remade under any sky. In those lists and bundles, families carried not only supplies, but a fragile map of survival, the daily details that would shape every meal, every dawn, and every weary night on the long road west. Flour in the mid-1800s was not the bleached, enriched powder we see on shelves today. For a pioneer household, the choice came down to 3 distinct kinds: shorts, middlings, and superfine. Each one carried its own texture, price, and promise, and each told a little story about the people who bought it and the bread they hoped to bake. Imagine a dim mill where dust motes hung like suspended snow, caught in a pale shaft of light. There, flour didn't present as a single, uniform thing, but as a small, rough hierarchy. The coarsest of the 3, labeled simply as shorts, sat somewhere between the ragged edge of bran and the fuller body of whole wheat. It was poorly sifted, speckled with husks and bits of grain, duller to the eye and grainy to the touch. Not refined into purity, it felt honest and blunt. Practical flour for families who counted every penny and needed bread on the table more than elegance on a plate. Beside the shorts, middlings told a different story. These were what remained when millers tried to separate bran from the heart of the grain in pursuit of whiter flour. Middlings retained a concentrated strength. Higher in gluten, they made a dough with resilience and chew, a texture that spoke of wheat's inner vigor. Yet middlings were often the byproduct of the pursuit of something finer, a surplus that some mills regarded as waste. Rather than discard them, millers sold middlings cheaply, a pragmatic option for those who wanted a hearty loaf without paying for the finest grade. Then there was superfine, the flour that aspired to what would later be called modern white flour. Paler and smoother than the others, it sifted almost silently and left a faint, clean scent on the hands. But it wasn't the stark, bleached white many imagine. It leaned more toward what we'd call unbleached now, gentle and natural, with a whisper of the wheat's original color. Superfine represented refinement without artifice, the choice for bakers who wanted a lighter crumb, a cake that rose just so, or a white loaf that felt a step above the ordinary. Walk into a morning market of that era, and you could hear those choices in the bustle. Some shoppers hurried away with sacks of shorts, fully aware of its faults, but trusting its thrift. Some millers, after hours of turning and sorting, would bundle middlings away, a shrug and a practicality that found a different kind of customer, and a few hands reached instead for superfine, drawn by the quiet promise of delicacy. Each sack carried a small domestic drama about need, pride, and the shape of a household's meals. Picture the hands that handled these flowers, knuckled and flour-dusted, pausing to rub a little between thumb and forefinger, judging by feel whether the grain had been coaxed enough. Imagine the mill air, warm with a yeasty tang where shorts, middlings, and superfine mingled. An earthy perfume that tied the work to the field and the oven. The names were never just technical labels. They were markers on a spectrum of labor and taste, cost and aspiration, each with its own sound when shaken in a sack, and its own weight on the scales. These distinctions mattered because sifting and separation were more than culinary steps. They were small acts that shaped daily life. Short spoke of frugality and endurance, middlings of surplus turned useful, and superfine of refinement that stopped short of modern bleaching. Together they mapped the intimate economies of an age, how households managed scarcity, how mills balanced production and waste, and how a community decided what counted as acceptable bread. In the end, these flowers shaped the simplest ritual of all, the making of bread, the breaking of a crust. From coarse shorts to resilient middlings to the almost lift of superfine, every handful carried a choice about flavor, texture, and dignity. Those choices, quietly made in kitchens and markets across the country, stitched the day-to-day fabric of life, one loaf at a time. They baked bread on the trail every day. Sometimes it was done in small sheet-iron ovens tucked among the gear, sometimes in heavy cast-iron Dutch ovens set into coals, and sometimes biscuits were fried in a skillet, sizzling and steaming under the wide sky. That regular warm smell of baking was as much a comfort as food itself. Out on the open prairie, those ordinary comforts turned into a small, constant worry. Trees were few, if there at all, and the long wind-swept grasslands offered no ready supply of split logs to feed a cooking blaze or warm a freezing night. Building fires on the trip was problematic because firewood was scarce, and the travelers learned to look down at their feet rather than up at the horizon. What they used instead were the little treasures of the plain, small piles of dried buffalo chips, the hard, weathered patties of dried buffalo manure that lay scattered like natural tinder across the grass. Gathered into compact stacks, these chips proved remarkably reliable. When a spark found them, they burned steadily, giving off a consistent, even heat that a weary hand could trust through long hours. There was none of the acrid, clinging stench one might imagine. The chips burned with little odor, an almost neutral fuel that let the night smells of prairie grass and distant sky remain undisturbed. The fire's light was clean and steady, the kind of light that made faces and pans glow without filling noses with smoke. At the edge of camp, by that simple, patient light, people bent to the small ritual of fire-making, scooping up chips, stacking them just so, nudging the embryonic embers until a real flame took hold. The steady burn of the chips meant those embers did not demand constant attention. Cooks could tend pots and Dutch ovens, tending bread and stew, while others sat close and talked, or fell silent, and listened to the wind moving across the open land. There was a quiet companionship in those moments. The soft clink of utensils, the low conversation, the occasional laugh, all held within a modest circle of warmth. The fire was more than fuel. It was a center for the camp's life, a place where stories were told and plans were made beneath the wide, empty sky. But the supply was finite, and when the chips ran low, the answer came from the plants of the plain. Sagebrush, brittle and abundant where trees were not, was gathered and used to keep the fires alive. The sage burned hotter and quicker than the chips, but it was there when needed, and so the campfire continued to be a small, fierce island of warmth beneath a widening sky. In the days before commercial yeast, bakers faced real limits. Any yeast available had a short shelf life and usually came from breweries as a byproduct of beer making. So it wasn't something you could pack up for a long journey. Sourdough starters offered another option, but they were slow and fussy. They needed time to work, and rising dough or pastries demanded a steady, unmoving place, hard to find on the road or in a crowded wagon. By the end of the 18th century, a quiet change began to slip out of kitchens and into early laboratories. It came in the form of a crystalline powder known to cooks and chemists as saleratus, the direct ancestor of the baking soda we use today. In candlelit rooms and under the first gas lamps, curious hands and careful eyes tested salts and watched vapors. They learned that this pale mineral was a form of bicarbonate of soda, and that under heat it did something almost magical. It released invisible bubbles of carbon dioxide that could lift a mass of dough from dense to light. Picture the first loaves made with that powder. Dough, beaten and folded by calloused hands, sat heavy and expectant. A small scoop of the pale, grainy powder was folded in, unassuming as flour but with work hidden inside it. When the dough met the heat, the powder began to awaken. Tiny bubbles threaded through the sticky mass, expanding pockets of air until the dense weight loosened into a yielding loaf. Crust browned and crackled, and the scent of warmed grain filled the room. An ordinary kitchen transformed, as if by alchemy, into a place of quiet miracles. This knowledge didn't stay in laboratories. It traveled with people, tucked into chests and panniers alongside tools and family heirlooms. As settlers moved west across the continent, the value of such a substance became plain. Along long routes like the Oregon Trail, near the weathered landmark we now call Independence Rock in present-day Wyoming, travelers and trappers found natural deposits rich in the very salts that could be turned into saleratus. There, in the wide silence of the plains, Earth itself offered a hint. Minerals that could make dough rise almost as reliably as a well-tended hearth. The human side of this story is quietly intimate. Imagine a wagon train paused at dusk, the sun flattening gold across the prairie. A lantern swings, casting small shadows while someone mixes dough by hand. A small scoop of the white powder, once a curiosity of chemists, now a practical pantry staple, is folded into batter or dough with no fanfare, only a sense of relief. When the bread comes out of the coals or the makeshift oven, the change is plain. A softer crumb, a kinder texture, a piece of warmth that seems to hold the cold at bay for a little while longer. For families trying to make a home from a wagon, these loaves were more than food. They were comfort and a dependable improvement to daily life. Over the years, saleratus changed names and grew more refined. The same kitchen experiments feeding into the simple act of baking millions would come to know. But in that moment, between a lab's quiet light and the sweep of the open trail, the discovery felt elemental, a meeting of human curiosity and the subtle generosity of the earth, producing loaves that lifted, fed, and carried with them a small, steady kind of hope. The other staple of trail life was bacon, though bacon then meant any pig meat from the sides, hams or shoulders that had been salt-cured for the road. It came in slabs and coils, wrapped in cloth or packed in barrels, the fat streaked through the meat like little white maps. That same fat, which made it rich and nourishing, was also its curse. Bacon rarely survived the whole journey. Heat, time, and rough handling turned some of it rancid. Other pieces suffered insect infestation, small betrayals of maggots and flies that crept in where the cure had failed. A man might open a pack expecting comfort and find instead a sour smell or crawling life. A reminder that even food could turn against you out on the trail. When their stores were chewed down to nothing and the last slices of hardtack were thin and tasteless, fresh pork became a rare salvation. Forts along the way would sell salt-cured meat, but at a steep price, and men who had gone days on stale rations watched those offerings with an almost animal hunger. When a coil was unrolled and the smoke and stained fat hit the air, it promised warmth and strength like a small, immediate miracle. Coins were counted twice. Bargains were struck with half a smile, and the trade of appetite for coin left a bitter aftertaste, even as the first crisp bite eased the cold and the weariness. For a few hours the camp brightened. Voices loosened, laughter slipped out softer and more private. But everyone knew the truth. Those high prices were paid from already scant resources, a costly indulgence that could not be afforded often, unlike salt pork or barreled beef, which rode along in their brine. Bacon traveled dry, kept tucked away in bug-proof bags or wooden boxes. In hot country, it might even be buried in bran, a folk trick believed to stop the fat from absorbing dirt and heat. By the time the sun climbed high enough to burn the morning chill from their bones, the wagons sighed and creaked along the rutted trail. From a low basket or a patched sack came the smell of parched corn, a scent as ordinary as it was precious. Pioneers prized that stubborn grain for reasons beyond taste. Left in a tin or wrapped in cloth and stripped of its dampness by the merciless sun, or a quick turn in a hot oven, those kernels kept. They did not rot in a rainy week, nor mildewed in the humid span between settlements. In a life measured by miles rather than months, hard-browned corn was a small insurance against hunger. There was an intimacy to preparing it. Hands darkened by smoke, and Travel scooped a few handfuls, feeling for firm kernels before tipping them into a skillet to toast until they snapped with a dry, satisfying pop. At noon, bread bags of corn might be spread on a wagon cover and baked slowly beneath the straight sun until the grains shrank and hardened. Later, when a rock, a mortar, and pestle, or a rough hand mill came to hand, those parched kernels were beaten and ground, animal and human work moving in time together, until the grain became a coarse flour, almost a powder, streaked with tiny toasted bits that smelled of smoke and summer. When the kettle was set above the coals, that rough flour met boiling water and performed a quiet transformation. It thickened into a humble mush, steam lifting in a soft veil as someone stirred with a worn wooden spoon. From bowls scarred by years of travel, hot porridge was ladled and passed with a kind of grateful reverence. The act of eating it, scooping, blowing, tasting, felt almost ceremonial after a long day on the trail. There was another small miracle beside the porridge. Milk, drawn warm from the travelers' cows. Those animals were tethered each evening beside the camp, keeping pace with the party and offering a steady, creamy relief. Poured plain over the mush or stirred in to cool and soften, the milk turned coarse meal into something gentle and sustaining, giving the simple grain a richness that carried a hint of home. It was no feast by a town table's reckoning, but it fed the body and steadied the spirit, feeling uneasy on cold mornings or after hard labor. The porridge and milk made a plain grain taste like comfort. Around small fires, with sun-dark faces and tired hands, people ate in companionable silence, taken in by a food that would travel and endure. The parched corn, dried or roasted, ground into a simple, dependable meal, and made whole by the milk of the cows that kept pace with them across the miles. Dried fruits were a staple across 19th century America, tucked into saddlebags and pantry chests alike. Dried vegetables, however, were another story. Pioneers rarely carried them until 1859, when Randolph Marcy published The Prairie Traveler, a handbook for overland expeditions, and suggested every traveler bring desiccated vegetables, a preservation method that had seen heavy use during the Crimean War. The idea slowly spread along the trails, changing what people packed and how they fed themselves when the stores were thin. By dusk, the camp settled into a small, tired hush. Wagon wheels had stopped their complaining for the night. Horses nuzzled their hay, and the day's tracks cooled and smeared into the dark. When conversation thinned to sighs and the embers steadied into a thin, steady red, someone would unroll a burlap sack and lift out a handful of green beans, raw, pale, and harder than they looked, like little stones that promised warmth and a simple meal. Coffee on the trail was not an everyday luxury. It was a ritual stitched into the long, dusty rhythm of travel. It was often the thing people protected most tightly, the last little reserve when other comforts were gone. Ground or roasted coffee spoiled faster in rough conditions, so kernels were usually carried unroasted. These green beans traveled stubbornly, patient and slow to change, waiting for the moment when a skillet could be set over a grateful flame, and someone could give them the attention they required. Roasting was its own small ceremony. A skillet was held above the fire until the iron warmed and threatened to glow. Then the green kernels were poured in. They rattled and rolled, a tiny clack, like distant rain. At first, there was only a faint, vegetal whisper. As heat coaxed out the oils, the beans browned and began to pop softly, a rhythm like contentment. A practiced hand kept them moving. The flip of the wrist, the tilt of the pan, because one burnt bean could spoil the whole lot. Smoke curled up, not quite bitter, carrying the honest promise of what was to come. After roasting, the beans felt warm beneath the palm, their surface darker and a little softer. Then came the grinder, a modest, well-worn tool with a handle and teeth that had seen many turns. It took muscle and patience to crank it, the metal grinding against seed, the steady rhythmic creak as the kernels surrendered into coarse grounds. Each turn of the handle felt like small work toward something hopeful. Each handful dropped with a muffled thud, and at last released a real, full aroma that stitched the camp together. Boiling water met the rounds, and the first cup was poured with ceremony into a tin mug. People cupped their hands around the metal, breathed in steam and scent, and for a few moments the trail's fatigue eased. That cup was not just a drink. It was consolation after a long day, proof that the world still held small pleasures, and a reminder of home. For many travelers, the beans and the ritual that made them into coffee were a quiet jewel, kept until there was nothing left to spare. In the faint light of the fire, over the taste of something made and shared, the journey somehow felt less relentless. They had come west with hard-stocked wagons and lean hopes, but what took more lives than storms or sudden river crossings was never the weather at all. It was the slow, relentless hand of sickness. In the mid-1800s, on those cramped, dust-choked trails, disease was the great enemy, the quiet one that crept into a camp at night and left fewer voices around the fire in the morning. Doctors were rare companions. What people carried instead was a small chest of remedies that seemed almost a personal reliquary, a lifeline made of tin and glass. Inside that kit lay a handful of things that might mean the difference between life and a slow fade. A little blue mass sat folded in paper, a compact, mercury-based remedy people swallowed for a bewildering array of ailments. There were a vial or two of dark liquid that clinked against the tin, a roll of gauze, a spoon for measuring, and a few needles for the kinds of stitches or desperate interventions no one wanted, but sometimes needed. The blue parcel was talked about around every fire, prescribed, trusted, argued about. It was used for everything from the common constipation that slowed a wagon to the terrible coughs that hinted at tuberculosis. Men and women would cradle that tiny thing as if it contained the answer to calamity, passing it forward with a muttered prayer when some neighbor grew weak or fevered. Opium sat beside it in a small, somber bottle. Not an exotic luxury, but the primary comfort against pain, a softening balm for wounds and feverish nights when sleep would not come. Quinine, bitter and potent, was another go-to. A few drops taken at the right moment could be the difference between a restless evening and a night where the tremors eased enough for a body to rest. There was no certainty in these measures, only hope and necessity. This was all the medicine the trail offered. So the camps moved on, the wagons creaked, and the little blue mass and its fellows did their quiet work. Crude and limited, so they were more than chemicals in a box. Gestures of faith, a desperate attempt to hold illness at bay beneath the dust and the wide, indifferent sky. The first thing you noticed was the sound. Bayonets and belts, the dull clank of brass cartridge boxes, the hard geometry of muskets stacked against one another. Metal spoke in a steady metallic language, rattles, clicks, and the impatient scrape of iron. And threaded through that chorus of steel was something older and softer. A heavy dented 5-gallon drum sat where hands could reach it, incongruous among the hard tools. Stenciled or scrawled across its flank, in a practical hand, was a polite euphemism. Medicinal spirits. It was a courteous lie, a civilian phrase that masked a single, unmistakable truth. Inside there was no exotic tonic, only the clear brown burn of whiskey, brandy, or rum. Spirits that had been distilled in barrels and carried from lip to lip in tin cups. When the bung was pulled, the drum gave off a sharp, warming perfume that cut clean through sweat, smoke, and gunpowder. The scent steadied the breath for a moment, a small, honest comfort at the edge of chaos. Men would lift the rim to pour a quick measure, not just for whatever first aid it might supply, but for courage and for comfort. The liquor caught the light and glinted like a brief private sun in the palm. Amid bayonets and bullets, in a kit of weapons and hard implements, that drum was a different kind of tool, crude and decisive, undeniably human. A small repository of solace kept deliberately close to the clatter of arms. Everyone carried weapons for protection and to provide meat along the trail. Most travelers had a muzzle-loading long gun, musket or rifle, slung where it could be reached at a moment's notice. Pistols were rare and expensive, kept by few. Still, every wagon held gunpowder, shot molds, and lead for casting rifle balls, a small arsenal packed among the pots and blankets, the means to fend off danger or to feed the family when game was scarce. They loaded their lives into wood and canvas and set off, each wagon a careful, stubborn selection of the ordinary things that make a family's day. Folded garments, sun-faded shirts, wool coats patched again and again, dresses smoothed free of dust for Sunday, were tucked into the lowest reaches of the wagons, wrapped in oilcloth or blankets to keep the grit out. Bundles of cooking pots and iron skillets, kettles for boiling, cups and spoons, and the odd frying pan that had been in the family for as long as anyone could remember, were lashed alongside rope and spare harnesses. In the evening, these were the items that turned a rattling camp into a home. A kettle singing over embers, a shirt spread on a rock to dry, a child's bonnet laid on a log. Camping supplies rode with the everyday tools of life. Bedrolls and tenting flaps, lantern oil and flint, ropes and stakes. The small practical things that turned a roadside clearing into a sheltered night. As essential as the axe and hammer that lived in every traveling household. Day-to-day tools, from sewing needles and thimbles to plows, repair wrenches, and hammers, were there because the long road made improvisation necessary. An iron file, a spare spoke, a pocket knife could be the difference between moving on and being stranded. Livestock supplies traveled too. Sacks of grain for the oxen and horses, barrels of salt, spare shoes, and bindings for sore feet. Farmers did not leave behind the means of sowing a future. Seed and plow blades were loaded with the same careful deliberation as clothing, for they were promises of the fields to come. To carry seed was to carry hope, not just preservation of the present, but the blueprint of a harvest, yet to be coaxed from distant soil. Skilled craftsmen moved in a different register. Many brought not only their personal effects, but additional wagons all their own, heavy with the tools of a trade, planes and chisels, leather-working punches, a blacksmith's tongs and bellows. Those extra vehicles were neither luxury nor vanity. They were livelihoods on wheels, a portable craft shop that could be set up at the next settlement or camp to mend shoes, shape wood, or shoe the stock that kept the trains moving. Woven through all this practical cargo were the small things people would not surrender. A few keepsakes wrapped carefully and held in the center of a trunk, a photograph tucked into a Bible, a ribbon tied to a child's toy. At the same time, necessity forced terrible choices. Many family heirlooms, heavy furniture, ornate frames, the grand things that once spoke of generations, were discarded along the route, left where the path allowed, and the wagons would not. Those abandonments were mourned in quiet ways. They were private reckonings held beside the more visible dramas of the trek. Among the cargo most often insisted upon were the family Bible and the family cow. The Bible was a touchstone, read aloud at night by lamplight or by the glow of embers, its pages a link to the past and a recitation of hope. The cows were less sacred, but no less treasured. Keen that provided milk on the road, a measure of steady nourishment, and a living reminder of home. There was a rhythm to all this packing and pruning, a steady calculus of what could travel and what would have to be left. Every strap tightened, every trunk shifted, every barrel rolled into place, was a small resolve against the unknown that lay ahead. In the creak of axles and the shuffle of animals, the most ordinary objects, clothes, pots, plow blades, a worn Bible, a faithful cow, became more than things. They became the scaffolding of a new life, the practical and tender necessities families carried with them across miles of sky and dust. The trail was never an empty corridor of hardship. It moved like a village across the plains, a place where ordinary life went on in an extraordinary setting. Oxen grazed at the edges of camp, while smoke from cook fires drifted up into a wide, patient sky. People married beside creaking wagons, hurried vows whispered between steering and supper, and neighbors turned a tin cup into a wedding cup for an impromptu celebration. Laughter rose sometimes like dry tinder against the cold, brief and bright. Children were born on the road as naturally as sunrises. A cry would cleave the morning mist, a new life wrapped in a shawl, and passed from one pair of tired hands to another. Midwives, armed mainly with hard-won experience and quiet resolve, guided those arrivals into daylight. The whole company waited, relieved, watchful, as if the newborn were a small gift the trail itself had gifted them. Not every relationship survived the strain of daily danger and scarcity. Some couples grew closer, tightened by shared fears and small victories. Others slowly unspooled, each mile exposing differences that could not be mended. Anger and sorrow were as much part of the journey as hope. Lovers drifted apart under the pressure of worry, hunger, or the ceaseless grind of cold mornings, and private griefs unfolded openly along the road because there was nowhere else to hide them. Wagon mishaps were a constant, immediate threat. Iron rims froze and cracked, axles splintered with a sound like a tree giving way, and wheels sank into soft earth until men and women heaved, cursed, and worked until the sun burned the dust into red. A spilled load of provisions could mean days of extra hardship. A torn canvas could turn a passing rain into a new and unwelcome enemy. But every catastrophe also called forth endurance and quick thinking. A harness mended with leather scraps, a wheel jury-rigged from borrowed parts, a dozen hands together to dig out the stuck wagon. From those shared labors and small mercies, a kinship grew that had nothing to do with blood. Strangers became watchful companions, the nearest faces to call on when fear crept in after dark. People traded stories and bread, patched each other's clothes, and kept vigil beside the sick. Humor slipped in on the edge of sorrow, a wry remark around the fire, a teasing gesture, a soft defiance against the hard road that kept spirits from collapsing. In the end, the trail shaped them in ways both expected and strange. By losses and repairs, by births and weddings, by partings and reunions. But more than the hardships or the hand repairs, it was the human connections forged in the dust and dusk that many carried away. Those bonds, born of necessity and kindness, became for countless travelers the true reward at the end of a long, relentless road. Many of the emigrants who reached Oregon or California arrived with almost nothing. Some were starving. Others had a few jars of preserved food, but were sick and worn out from the road. Many had spent their last dollar. They came down the trail dusty and ragged, the last holdouts of long, hopeful caravans, men and women with faces like weathered maps, children clinging to mothers or asleep on shoulders, bundles and broken dreams tied to the backs of wagons. They had not come to an empty land waiting to be taken. Instead, they found people who had finished the hardest part of the crossing and already called a place home. Those pioneers looked up from their fields and chores and walked out along the rough tracks to meet them, hands ready and hearts steadier for having been there before. The first task was painfully simple and urgent. Help the stragglers, families slowed by a broken axle, a man felled by fever, a woman who had given birth on the road. Each was met not with suspicion, but with blankets, extra rations, and steady assistance. Neighbors hitched on to haul wagons from mud, mended tattered clothing, and shared stoves and shelter. Older settlers lent tools and showed how to set up the leanest winter quarters. A hastily framed shack, a sod house heaped with straw, a tent braced against wind. Fires were built not just for warmth, but as beacons in the long evenings, a small but unmistakable signal that someone cared. Most newcomers had arrived at the worst possible time. Late fall and early winter had come, and the earth was already closing down. There was no planting left, no easy season for breaking soil and sowing seed. What could be done was urgent and modest. Clear a place for shelter, stack what firewood could be found, shore up roofs against the wind. Many families did no more than throw together crude winter quarters, crude refuges meant to keep bodies from freezing and bellies from emptying while they waited for spring. The look on a family's face when they set the last sod or hammered the last plank summed up the season. Grateful for a roof, quietly afraid of a long, hungry winter. This was not work for a few hands. Entire communities pulled together. Neighbors knocked on doors and gave what food they could spare. Churches that had been full of worship on Sundays turned into centers of relief. Stoves were lit in basements, lofts and meeting rooms were cleared for sleeping. Volunteer cooks ladled stew by the potful. Civic committees, ordinary people appointed or self-organized, met around kitchen tables to organize supplies, map who needed what, and cajole local merchants and farmers into lending a hand. They kept lists, arranged wagons to deliver bread and flour, and found odd jobs so newcomers had both purpose and something to eat. There was urgency in that kindness. Thousands of new neighbors stood on the edge of want. Many were armed because that had been necessary on the road. To let them go hungry was to invite trouble. To abandon them was to risk the desperation that makes people dangerous to themselves and others. Established settlers saw a disaster that needed careful handling, so the help was practical and sometimes hard-edged. It aimed not only to save lives for the moment, but to carry people to a point where they could produce something of their own. Work quickly became the currency of survival. Anyone willing to work found employment without question. Fields to fence when the thaw came, stock to tend, barns to mend, and 1,000-odd jobs only 100 hands could tackle. Payment often came not in coin, but in what mattered. A bowl of stew, a sack of grain, a night under a roof that would not leak. In the eyes of those who had already learned how to survive, these arrangements were not mere charity, but a lifeline, the first steps toward independence, a way to get seed into the ground when the season allowed, and to prove up a homestead so it might be claimed. So the winter settled in with small, daily rituals. Men rose before dawn to stack wood. Women traded recipes for thin soups that would fill a child's belly without wasting flour. Children learned to drag a loaded sled without complaint. Every favor returned, every borrowed tool brought back, every parcel of food shared became part of a larger, fragile architecture of survival. The sound of an axe, the smell of stew, the low light of many small fires, these things stitched together a community. Through hard labor, neighborly resolve, and communal compassion, the new arrivals were kept alive long enough to hope for spring. When the thaw finally came, they would have a chance to work the soil and make a claim on the land they had sought. Until then, they survived on the kindness that turned strangers into neighbors and turned a winter of want into a season of endurance and eventually of new beginnings. I'm working from what you've called Section 12, the Locket Saga, author note. And right now I don't have the historical fragment you want expanded. Could you paste the original text here? Say the word and I'll take that raw fragment and turn it into a vivid audiobook-ready narrative about the locket and the people who carried it. When you send the fragment, I'll expand it, roughly 5 times the length. But I will not invent or alter the facts. Every fact, date, and key event you gave will be preserved exactly as written. My job will be to weave those facts into a fluid, engaging story that's full of texture and listening room detail while keeping the truth intact. A few quick questions to make sure I match your expectations. Do you want a particular narrative voice? A third-person narrator, a first-person descendant, or an omniscient storyteller? Is there a preferred tone? Warmly nostalgic, stark and solemn, lyrical, or brisk and cinematic? Do you have a target length or runtime in mind, an approximate word count or minutes? And are there any names, pronunciations, or sensitive details I must preserve exactly as written? Paste the fragment and answer any of those questions if you have a preference, and I'll get started. I'll treat your material with care. Build scenes that let listeners see the locket's worn metal and hear the footsteps of the people who carried it, and return a polished voiceover-ready text that keeps every original fact exactly where you placed it.